Hi, welcome to Unit 26, Support Young People to Take Collective Action. To give this unit some context, we're going to start by looking at a collective action project in boarding. So this is the story. It was the second lockdown for the school, and this impacted the boarders because they were very restricted in where they could go outside the boarding residence and grounds. Head of Girls Boarding, Anne Wells, knew that the girls were becoming bored and spending a lot of time on their phones and iPads. Anne called a meeting after dinner on Thursday evening and divided the girls into small groups with a leader in each group, and asked the girls to talk about their needs in the current lockdown environment and also about their interests and document these in 2 lists. After the meeting, the leaders got together and entered all the needs and interests onto a spreadsheet. There was a very broad range of needs from the 84 girls, but there were common themes which included not enough activities and needing an outdoor area with a reflection area, possibly a fire pit, a vegetable and herb garden, outdoor tables and chairs, pets, possibly guinea pigs, rabbits, poultry. Anne worked with the leaders to call a second meeting, and the leaders reported back to all the students. The groups got together, they discussed the idea of an outdoor area, possible areas on the school site, and different uses for the outdoor area. The leaders met together afterwards and discussed the outcomes of the meeting. Several groups had identified an unused area of land behind the kitchen dining area, and the leaders thought this an ideal place for a girls' outdoor area. Anne facilitated a meeting with the principal where the leaders explained the ideas for an outdoor area and asked if they could use the space behind the kitchen. The principal said she would consider this if the group could provide a detailed plan for the site. Anne worked with the leaders to contact landscape designers in their area, and one designer agreed to meet with the students by Zoom video teleconference. Student leaders emailed the dimensions of the land and some photos. A group of students met with the landscape designer 4 times, learned some of the basics of landscape design, and developed a design for the area which they took back to the whole group of boarders. Each group had a copy of the plan on which they made suggestions for changes. The leaders met again afterwards to agree on a final plan to present to the principal. The principal agreed to the plan, offered a budget to cover some of the costs, and told the group they could put in requests for assistance from the grounds and maintenance staff. The student leaders decided to form special interest groups for each part of the project, and they formed groups for the herb garden, the vegetable garden, paths and paved areas, seats, tables and fire pit, the rabbit project and the poultry project. The agreed process was that students in each group would get advice from a professional or somebody with experience by Zoom meeting, decide on a plan they had for their project, take the plan to the whole group for consideration, put the plan into action, evaluate the plan and report back to the whole group, and then make changes where needed. And that's basically how a collective action project works. And most of the students were very engaged in the project, and there was a very strong sense of ownership. So let's just unpack this and see how this works. Of young people. This unit is about supporting young people to identify common issues, needs and interests, developing a collective plan, forming alliances with stakeholders, implementing strategies and monitoring and evaluating strategies. To effectively achieve this, leaders must have a mindset that values and empowers participation and engagement by young people. Effective youth participation is creating opportunities for young people to be involved in influencing, shaping, designing and contributing to policy and the development of services and programs. It's about involving young people, asking for their opinions and advice with the support of adults. Effective youth participation is based on these principles. It's about young people being informed, about young people having an effect on the outcomes, organising themselves, making decisions or being involved in decision-making processes, being involved in follow-up. Reasons for the participation of young people include youth participation means better decisions and increased efficiency. It contributes to positive youth development. It improves credibility and reputation. It enhances the organisation's relationship with a young person, and it is a right. When we look at youth participation, one model is the ladder of youth participation by sociologist Roger Hart, and it's shaped in the form of a ladder which has two zones, non-participation and then degrees of participation. So the first three steps are in the non-participation zone, and the next five are in the degrees of participation. So in the non-participation zone, we've got manipulation, which occurs when children and young people do not understand the issues motivating a necessary process or their role in that process. Decoration, when children and young people are put on public display during an event, a performance, or some other sort of activity organised for a specific purpose, but they do not understand the meaning or the intent of their involvement. Tokenism. This occurs in those instances where children are apparently given a voice, but in fact have little or no choice about the subject or the style of communicating it, little or no opportunity to formulate their own opinions. So they're the first three steps, and they're in the non-participation zone. So then we go to this next section, and step number 4, these are degrees of participation. Participation occurs when children and young people understand the intentions of the project, know who made the decisions regarding their involvement and why, have a meaningful rather than a decorative or tokenistic role, and they volunteer for the project after the project was made clear to them. So that's assigned but informed. Number 5 is consulted and informed. And you can probably see the steps up the ladder, they're quite different as you move up. Consulted, this occurs when children act as consultants for adults in a manner which has great integrity. The project is designed and run by adults, but children understand the process and their opinions are treated seriously. Adult-initiated shared decisions with children. This is step number 6. This occurs when adults initiate participatory projects, but they share decision-making authority or management with children. The next step is child-initiated and directed. This occurs when children and young people conceptualize and carry out complex projects by working cooperatively in small or large groups. While adults may observe and assist children or young people, they do not interfere with the process or play a directive or managerial role. And number 8, the last step, is child-initiated shared decisions with adults. This occurs when children, though primarily teenage youth in this case, share decision-making authority, management or power with adult partners and allies. In Hart's ladder model, it does not mean that higher levels of participation are always better in all contexts and for all situations. There could be situations where different circumstances could call for different levels of participation. Sometimes a lower level of participation may help prepare a young person before moving further up the ladder. So that's Hart's ladder of participation. There's another model of youth participation called the Pathways to Participation model. This is a very interesting model which has 5 levels, and you see a pathway up the levels. And one interesting thing about this is you can see up there on level 3, there's a red asterisk and it says you must reach this point to meet the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So when we look at the levels of participation, we start off with number 1, children are listened to. Number 2, children are supported in expressing their views. Number 3, children's views are taken into account. Number 4, children are involved in decision-making processes. Number 5, children share power and responsibility with adults for decision-making. In Pathways to Participation, adults with power and authority need to show listening skills and respond in ways that create openings for young people to have participation in decision-making. Pathways to Participation is useful for understanding if there are activities, processes and procedures to support youth participation within an organisation. This can occur by ensuring that there's policy that requires the organisation and staff to practice youth participation. And we have our first assessment question. It asks you to read participation in the notes, examine Hart's ladder, and answer these questions. Where do you think boarding residences should be on this ladder? Is there opportunity for youth participation in decisions in a boarding residence? So can there be this sort of participation in a boarding residence, and explain how that could happen? And then thirdly, does your residence support youth participation, and can you explain how? When we look at the organisation approach to the participation of young people, we need policies which specifically require student voice and student participation, and detailed procedure and activities to enable youth participation. In the West Australian standards for non-government schools, there is this requirement. The school regularly reviews its policies and procedures and practices that aim to ensure student safety and well-being at school and during school-related activities, and can you see this bit in highlight? In consultation with its students. In the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations, these statements are included. Children and young people are informed about their rights, participate in decisions affecting them, and are taken seriously. There are processes to respond to complaints and concerns which are child-focused. Organisation policies which could include student participation include child protection, border safety and security, border holistic development, leadership development and social responsibility, border induction, grievances, complaints and feedback from borders, border health and well-being, including personal security, border behaviour management, rights and responsibilities of borders, supervision of students and pastoral care. So all of those policies could include an element of student participation. Organisations should have embedded in their values and ideology statements such as their vision statement, their mission statement, and their goals and objectives. So we should see this participation embedded in those documents. Assessment question 2 says, identify a process from your boarding residence that empowers students' participation. So can you think of a process from your boarding residence, from your procedures, your processes that empowers student participation, and describe that process? Next, we look at ethical practice with young people. It's crucial that youth work practice is ethical and that it conforms to the organisation's code of conduct. And this is a code of practice from YACVIC. This code is based on human rights and the following principles of youth work, and includes this: the empowerment of young people, young people's participation, social justice for young people, the safety of young people, respect for young people's human dignity and worth, young people's connectedness to all important people in their lives, such as family and community, positive health and well-being outcomes for young people, positive transitions and healthy development of young people. When youth workers are guided by these principles, there's a recognition of Indigenous people. Young people are their primary consideration. There's a duty of care. This is covered below, and same with privacy and confidentiality. There's boundaries, there's transparency, honesty, integrity. There's a social context to this, an anti-oppressive practice, non-discrimination, equity and self-awareness. There's cooperation and collaboration. There's knowledge, skill and self-care. So that's what occurs when youth workers are guided by these youth work ethic principles. Assessment question 3 asks, what do you see as 6 important ethical principles in a student boarding context? Next, we want to look at consent and young people. The legal capacity to consent is not age dependent, but of course age is a factor. A young person has the legal capacity to consent if they have the mental ability and the maturity to understand the nature and the effect of what they're consenting to. If you make the judgment that a young person does not have the capacity to give consent, then you should have a parent or guardian consent on their behalf. It is good practice to gain the parent or guardian's consent in addition to the young person's consent. This means the young person has support but is still actively involved in the decision about whether to take part or not. To be valid, consent needs to be informed, freely given, specific, and current. Informed means that the person has the capacity to understand the situation and the consequences of taking part. Freely given means the person can make his or her own decision, free from influences or pressures. Specific means consent applies only for the information to be used for the purpose outlined. Current means consent must not be given so long ago that relevant circumstances or the person's view may reasonably have changed. So question 4, assessment question 4, says if you make the judgment that a young person does not have the capacity to give consent and you require consent, what are your options? And assessment question 5 asks, to be valid, consent needs to include what 4 requirements? Next, we're going to look at power imbalances. This is where one individual occupies a position of authority over another. It can significantly impact a person's life and environment, and it can come from a difference in work status, age, difference in gender, or length of time within a group. A power imbalance is present in the boarding supervisor-student relationship, so there's always going to be this power imbalance there, and this is not in itself a negative thing. We all operate for much of the time within relationships where the power balance is uneven, particularly in education involvements with children and young people. To deal with a power imbalance, the youth worker needs to recognise the power exists, recognise the elements of that power, accept that these elements create an imbalance of power within the professional relationship, and then use power appropriately in relationships with children. Because of the power imbalance in relationships between the young person and the youth worker, boundaries are so important. Youth workers, boarding supervisors need to be familiar with industry boundaries for boarding staff, boundaries that are part of their own institution code of conduct. Youth workers need to ensure that they rigorously observe these boundaries in their professional relationships with young people. Assessment question 6 says from section 1.6, define a power imbalance. And assessment question 7, describe how to deal with a power imbalance. We want to look at how we identify common issues, needs, and interests of young people. We need to initiate activities that will enable that process, and these activities should do these things. These activities should be seen by young people as being relevant to their lives, background, and experiences. These activities should enable young people to address issues in ways that respond to their own priorities, interests, and needs. Should be flexible and allow for the young person's self-expression and creativity. Take place in a safe environment, particularly where the issues are personally confronting or challenging. Be seen by young people as having purpose, where they will personally get something out of the activity and build mutually respectful relationships. There's a range of different activities that could enable young people to identify common issues, needs, and interests, including these sort of activities: information sessions followed by group discussions, and these could also include visiting speakers or current affair type programs, group discussion processes, special interest groups, advisory groups, residence community mapping, where young people document residents' resources or activities, community mapping, where young people document the social structures in the broader community that are relevant to their issues and interests, surveys, feedback processes, interviews designed and implemented by young people, research projects, and support groups. So these are all the different sorts of activities that would help young people to identify these common issues and needs. Assessment question 7 says there's a list of activities that could enable young people to identify these common issues, needs, and interests. Which of these would work best in your context? And put down at least 4 of those. Young people need to develop relevant skills for these processes, such as developing and expressing an opinion, participating in group processes, analysing and making judgments, decision-making, problem-solving. These self-help skills enable the young person to actively contribute to the group process, and these skills and processes can be learned and practiced in a boarding context. Question 9 asks, what skills would help the young person actively contribute to identifying common needs, issues, and interests? Possibilities for responding to these issues, needs, and interests include these: acquiring information to better understand the issues and needs, establishing a project, such as this making a garden project, designing a t-shirt, setting up a gym, developing a program, such as a sport, art, music, fitness type program, join an existing group, such as a sports group, art class, horse riding, etc., purchasing required equipment, such as equipment, tools, consumable material, etc., and purchasing services, such as a hairdresser, tutor, manicurist, that sort of thing. So these are all possibilities for responding to needs and issues that have been raised. Question 10 asks this: when students have identified common interests, needs, and interests, they should look at the possibilities for responding, and the notes list 6 possibilities for responding. Provide an example of a student need, issue, or interest, and possible ways to respond, at least one. So provide an example of student needs, issues, and interests, 3 of those, and possible ways to respond to at least one. So an example is students have a need for fitness. They could acquire information about fitness, establish a gym, develop an exercise program, or join a local gym. Local institutions are a possibility for responding to these issues, needs, and interests, including local councils, including libraries, local church groups, church youth groups, service clubs such as Rotary, Apex and Lions, police and the court systems, hospitals and health professionals, local businesses and business groups, financial institutions. Assessment question 11 says this: local institutions are a possibility for responding to these needs, issues and interests. Provide an example of a student need, issue or interest, so provide 3 of them, and a local institution that could be involved, at least one local institution. E.g., students have an interest in finding ways they can volunteer in the community. They approach a local service club and the local councils to find ways they can volunteer. Next, we want to look at communication skills. To function successfully in a small group, students need to be able to communicate clearly on intellectual and emotional levels. Effective communicators can explain their own ideas, can express their feelings in an open, non-threatening way, can listen carefully to others, can ask questions to clarify others' ideas and emotions, can sense how others feel based on their non-verbal communication, will initiate conversations about group mood or process if they feel tensions brewing, can reflect on the activities and interactions of their group and encourage other group members to do well as well. Question 12 asks, what are 7 things that effective communicators can do? Communication and group work. Regular open communication. This is where group members share their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings. This is a must for successful group work, so this regular open communication. Unspoken assumptions and issues are very destructive to productive group functioning. When students are communicating openly with one another, a healthy group climate will emerge and an effective process can be followed. Assessment question 13 asks, what is open communication and why is it important in group work? For small groups to function effectively in a boarding context, students must understand both the climate within their group, So is the group inclusive, welcoming, comfortable, etc.? And the processes to achieve group tasks. Cohesion emerges as group members exhibit the following skills: openness, trust and self-disclosure, support and respect. And these are skills for a healthy group climate. Question 14 asks, list the skills for a healthy group climate. Skills for an effective group process include these: individual responsibility and accountability, constructive feedback, problem solving, management and organisation, knowledge of roles. So they are the skills for effective group process. And question 15 asks you to list the skills for an effective group process. We want to look at peer education. This is learning from one's peers. It's the education of young people by other young people, and it's based on the idea that it's possible to capture the naturally occurring impact of peers within their own networks to influence other young people's knowledge, attitudes and behaviour. So you're using young people to influence or educate or support other young people. Question 16 asks you to describe peer education and to provide an example. We want to move on to section 2, and this is about planning collective action. We want to look firstly at community development. Community development is defined as a process where community members are supported to identify and take collective action on issues which are important to them. So it's about empowering community members and creating stronger and more connected communities. It's a holistic approach grounded in the principles of empowerment, human rights, inclusion, social justice, self-determination and collective action. So that is community development. This question 17 asks, how is community development defined? Community development considers community members to be experts in their own lives and in their own community. It values community knowledge and wisdom. Programs are led by community members at every stage, from deciding on issues to selecting and implementing actions and evaluation. And there's an explicit focus on the redistribution of power to address the causes of inequality and disadvantage. Question 18 asks, what does community development do? And you have these answers here, of course. Let's look at youth development. Youth development refers to the stages that all children or all young people go through to acquire the attitudes, competencies, values and social skills that they need to become successful adults. So that is youth development. Question 19 asks you, what is youth development? Mapping and monitoring student participation. Mapping student participation is recording student participation when it occurred, the type of participation, and the participation event. One method of doing this is to use a table that lists the event, the context, is this event part of a larger event or a series of events, the time, the date, the type of participation, and the result or the impact. To work out the type of participation, the levels 4 to 8 of Hart's ladder could be used. So that's these levels here. Assigned but informed, consulted and informed, adult-initiated shared decisions, child-initiated and directed, child-initiated shared decisions with adults. And you can see here there's a mapping example from a collective action scenario. So you can see the events down the left-hand side: initial group discussion, leaders' first meeting, students meet with landscape designer, second meeting with landscape designer, the context of that, the date when it occurred, the type from Hart, what type of participation it is, and then any comments about this participation. So all students were involved and contributed, the leaders were engaged, and so on. So that is a mapping example. Mapping student participation is useful to ensure that student participation will occur, that it's of the right type, to show the impact or effect of youth participation, and to provide a record of student participation. Assessment question 20 asks, why is it helpful to map youth participation in a project? Next, we want to go on to look at support and encouragement. During this process of collective action, it's important to provide support and encouragement to students and to provide opportunities for participation. So this could include things such as respect, give young people a voice, listen to young people, accept, facilitate action, record and review. So let's unpack those a little bit. Respect. Treat all young people with respect. Use language which shows respect. Agree with young people on the rules for the group. Give young people a voice. Enable young people to influence the program. Appoint young people as members of committees. Assist young people to help write newsletters and reports. Listen. Supervisors listen to young people's suggestions. Ask individual young people and small groups their opinions. Encourage everyone to contribute and listen carefully. Accept young people's ideas. Revise projects to incorporate young people's ideas, work with young people to put their ideas into action, and then facilitate action. Support young people to put their plans into practice but don't take over. Enable young people to see what they've learned. Work with young people to recognise their own strengths and weaknesses. Enable young people to develop a confident attitude towards new challenges. And then record and review. Just keep a record of actions and any suggestions for follow-up. Assessment question 21 states, if you are involved in a collective action project similar to the scenario right back at the front of the notes, that collective action example, list 6 ways you could provide support and encouragement. Section 3 is about forming alliances with stakeholders. Firstly, we need to identify stakeholders, people who might be involved in, contribute to, or be impacted by collective action. So it could be other boarding students and day students, could be school grounds and maintenance staff, could be boarding staff, school staff, suppliers such as landscape suppliers, garden suppliers, etc. Question 22 asks, if you're involved in a collective action project similar to the scenario in the front of the notes, collective action example, then list the possible stakeholders. Support young people to carry out the following steps with possible stakeholders. Firstly, to document. So document the different stakeholders, their contact details, their interest in the project, possible role in the project, and resources that they could bring to the project. So you would spreadsheet that out and document those things. Question 23 says, when working out possible stakeholders, what would you encourage students to document? And then number 2 is contacting the different stakeholders. Ask for involvement as required, request assistance or resources as required, maintain contact and keep informed. Question 24 asks, in the process of contacting stakeholders, what 3 actions would you support students to do? And the first one is to ask for involvement as required. So the third one of these is acknowledge, a process for acknowledging and thanking stakeholders. For example, inviting the stakeholders to a meeting such as the opening of a project, publicly thanking, writing thank you emails, mentioning stakeholders in newsletters or having a plaque on a project, or even a small gift, that sort of thing. Question 25 asks, what 3 ways could students acknowledge the contribution of stakeholders? Next, we want to look at advocacy. Advocacy is an activity by an individual or a group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social institutions. And I know that sounds complicated, but it's really the act of speaking out on behalf of or in support of another person, place, or thing. When we're looking at the models and tools of advocacy, we've got self-advocacy, individual advocacy, and systems advocacy. They're the main different types. Self-advocacy is an individual's ability to effectively communicate, convey, negotiate, or assert his or her own interests, desires, needs, and rights. So it's about speaking up for oneself. Individual advocacy is where a person or a group of people concentrate their efforts on just one or two individuals. There are two common forms of individual advocacy: informal and formal advocacy. And then we have systems advocacy, which is about changing policies, laws, or rules that impact on how somebody lives their lives. These efforts can be targeted at a local, state, or national level. They focus on changing laws or simply written or unwritten policy. Question 26. What is advocacy and what are the three main types of advocacy? The steps in individual advocacy include listening to the person they're working with, find the issues they can help them with, giving the person information about their options for addressing the issues, help them to present and express their views and wishes to others, help them to understand and defend their rights, be on the side of the person. Question 27. What are the main steps in individual advocacy? Advocacy is different from mediation and negotiation because in advocacy, the advocate takes a side. So it takes the side of the person that they're advocating for, which is probably, in our case, a student. Mediation, negotiation outcomes, they have an outcome that's acceptable to both sides. And that outcome might be slightly different to what each person was originally seeking. And the mediator and the negotiator is impartial. They don't take sides. So can you see the difference there? In mediation and negotiation, the person who's doing that is impartial. They don't take any sides. But in advocacy, you do take a side. You'll take the side of the person that you're advocating for, which is most likely the student. Question 28 says, how is advocacy different from mediation and negotiation? So let's have a look at negotiation. People or groups who have a different position on an issue reach a compromise or agreement with which they're both satisfied. Both parties move from their original position and they move towards the other party until they achieve a compromise or a win-win outcome that they're all happy with. When we're involved in a process of negotiation, it includes these steps: preparation, so preparing for the negotiation, understanding all the facts, etc. Discussion between the two people or two parties, clarification of goals, negotiating towards that win-win outcome that you can both be happy with, getting agreement, and then implementing a course of action. Question 29. Define negotiation and list the steps in a negotiation process. Then we want to look at dispute resolution. So during the course of your project, it's likely that you might have some disagreement or dispute. And so these are some steps towards resolving that dispute. Listen to the other person or group. Make sure that we're listening to what they're saying. Explain how you feel and how this dispute has affected you. Try to understand how the dispute has affected the other person or the other party. Suggest what you think should be done to resolve the problem. Try and negotiate out a mutually agreeable solution. And if the dispute cannot be resolved, then involve a mediator who's impartial. Question 30. What are the main steps in dispute resolution process? Then we come to step 4, which is implementing strategies and action plans. During implementation, provide information to the group about effective group processes and support students to learn and implement these processes. These effective group processes include individual responsibility and accountability, constructive feedback, problem solving, management and organisation, and knowledge of roles. Question 31. During implementation, students can be supported by providing information about group processes. List 5 group processes. Then we're looking at these basic implementation tasks: formalising partnership agreements, having a project plan of the implementation steps, making adjustments to the project, developing information and communication systems, commencing the project, monitoring and evaluation systems in place, and then responding to challenges and issues. So let's go back and unpack these a little bit. So formalising partnership agreements, it's really important that all parties are clear about what their role is and their responsibilities at the start of the implementation process. It's great to have an implementation plan or a project plan, and these detail how a project is to be implemented, including the range of activities, the timetable of all the different activities, the project delivery processes, staff support required, resources required for each part of the project, and how you can source resources. So students might need to source resources and obtain funding from the school or residents, or maybe from another source. And then making adjustments to the project. Students may need support to adjust the project during the implementation stage if the project has changed in some way. The project of implementation might cause changes or might reveal that the project is different from the original plan. And then developing information and communication systems. So it's useful to support students to develop this effective communication processes as the project is implemented. It could just be an agreed process, such as the use of texting, emails, meetings, etc. Or students might use phone apps, such as WhatsApp. Students may also need the use of computers and software to support the project. And then commencing the project. Once a project is agreed, stakeholders engaged and resources available, then the project gets started. Once it has commenced, students must ensure that the project is in accordance with what was agreed and with what was agreed with the group and what was agreed with stakeholders, so they're not heading off in a completely different direction. Then monitoring and evaluation systems. Include a plan to monitor the project and measure project progress. The evaluation that occurs during the project is called process evaluation. Process evaluation is a continual collecting of data, such as student numbers, student attendance, the length of time, student satisfaction, those sort of things. Process evaluation should include opportunities for students and other stakeholders to provide feedback. And then part 7, responding to challenges and issues. And during any project, there's going to be some challenges. Circumstances can change. A project needs to be flexible enough to respond accordingly. The student group should meet regularly to review the process evaluation information, discuss changes in the project, and develop strategies to respond appropriately. Question 32. During the implementation of the project, students can be supported with some basic tasks. List 7 tasks that you would expect to see during implementation. The next part of collective action is monitoring and evaluating strategies. Monitoring and evaluating includes the documentation process and the evaluation process. We need to support young people to monitor and record progress. We need to assist them to identify outcomes and consequences. Some of these will be intended consequences and some will be unintended, things they didn't expect. We need to evaluate strategies and group processes, to provide reports as appropriate. Some of these will be to our stakeholders, some might be within our own organisations, and then to celebrate achievements, including personal development, skills development, and social change. The purpose of evaluation is to know if the project is meeting the objectives, to learn from the evaluation data and to make changes, to monitor progress, and then to judge a project's outcome. So that's the purpose of evaluation. Evaluation can be formal or informal, and some evaluation we just do informally every day when we make judgments or decisions based on the information that we receive. But the evaluation of a project is usually going to be more formal by collecting information in a more structured way. Evaluation can take place at different times during a project for different purposes. So it can be during the actual project, it can be after it's concluded, and it can be much later on to see if there was an impact. We need to support students to actually use the data from evaluation, not just to do the evaluation, but actually use the data. So collect the data and organise it, then analyse the data to discover what is this telling us, what's the information about the project, and then consider this information and consider if changes should be made to the project, and then use this in a reporting process as well. When we look at evaluation, there's three types of evaluation: process evaluation, outcome evaluation, and impact evaluation. Each type of evaluation should build on the evaluation that preceded it. So process evaluation occurs during the project. Outcome evaluation occurs after the project is finished and depends on a methodical process evaluation. So can you see how that outcome evaluation builds on the process evaluation? And then impact evaluation might occur, some length of time, maybe even some months after the conclusion of the project. And this is looking at, has there been an impact from this project? And impact evaluation depends on well-planned process evaluation and outcome evaluation. When you are documenting the project, you need good processes for documenting the parts of the process, such as the initial meetings and notes, who was in there, who was at the meeting, what was discussed, any conclusions from the meeting, that sort of thing. You need project plan documents, including documents that describe the project, the outcomes, plans and drawings, costings, letters of approval, stakeholder agreements, etc. You need process evaluation data. This might be a journal describing what is occurring within the project as the project goes along, or it may be information from forms such as attendance sheets. And then you need outcome evaluation data. This data can come from feedback processes such as interviews, questionnaires, measuring outcomes, etc. And then you'll need a report if required. In the project report, you'll have these things: a title page, acknowledgements, an executive summary, a table of contents, the body of the report, the main content of the report, the conclusion, and the report recommendations. The executive summary is very important in a project report because very often this is probably the only thing that many people will read. And that should be a fairly contained summary of the project and the outcomes, what the project achieved. It's important to celebrate milestones or achievement, as this adds new energy and momentum to the project. It's also important to recognise and celebrate personal development, such as skills development and social change, so that students understand the value of collective action and their particular project. So celebrating success is important. Students have their own ideas about how this could occur. It could be things like passing on, positive feedback from other people. It could be, with consent, publishing photos and articles on websites, Facebook and in publications, creating YouTube or TikTok movies or snapshots of the event. You could quote them in media releases, have a professional certificate made up, provide them with a reference letter for their CV, or nominate them for a community award. So with celebrating success, agree on how you're going to do this, and this could also be tangible rewards such as going out for dinner or a memorable event, freebies such as t-shirts, pens, bags, or interspersing time for fun and socialising during the actual project. So that's the end of this unit, and it's time for you to start your own collective action project. Thank you.